What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, bringing you another top Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. Folks, tons and tons of items to go through this week. First, we'll be touching on the very healthy graded card market of the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet 151 set. We'll be taking a look at a few of the raw card sales from the Japanese Pokemon Trading Card Game Classic. And to finish up, we'll be going over more Shining cards, Crystal cards, and Gold Star cards that you can shake a stick at. Quick shout out to today's auction recap sponsor. It's, of course, KantoShark.com, the ultimate Pokemon card marketplace. Visit KantoShark.com and check out their massive inventory of both graded cards and sealed product they have for sale, many of which are investment-worthy pieces that you can purchase from a very reputable seller. So whether you're a vintage collector, a modern collector, or both, go visit KantoShark.com and see what kind of deals they have for you. So folks, without further ado, let's jump into this auction recap, starting off with some very healthy prices, very healthy graded card prices from the Pokemon 151 set. At least I think they're doing very well. Here we have a illustration rare Machoke. Fantastic artwork right there, so much character, and PSA 10 has sold for $86 this week. We also saw this Metal Mew EX card sell as a PSA 10 for $130. Here is a ultra rare Erica's Invitation sold for $150. We even have the starter Middle Children selling for some pretty impressive prices. Here is a an Ivysaur illustration rare that sold for $152.50. We have a special illustration rare Alakazam EX sold this week for $242. Here we have an illustration rare Charmander, the first one I've seen come by in auction, sold for $260. And then we saw the illustration rare Wartortle sold for $261. And then the special illustration rare Charizard EX continues to have a very healthy PSA 10 price. We saw one sell for $550, another one for $560 this week. On to a few raw Japanese classic collection sales that we've seen come by. This is the newest set that's come out. The English versions have yet to be released, but here is a Japanese Charizard Holo sold for $182.50 earlier this week. And then we saw the trio, Charmander, Charmeleon, and Charizard, that sold for $177.50. And that's pretty much where it ends, folks, because the rest of these cards, at least the Japanese versions, don't really seem to be selling for a whole lot. Here is the Ivysaur, Charmeleon, and Wartortle, sold total for $27. Here is a Hitmonlee and a Hitmonchan that sold for $2.25. Chansey and Snorlax here sold for $5.50. Clefairy and Clefable here sold for $6.02. And then you have these other Pokemon, Magmar, Mr. Mime, Scyther, selling for $9.50. So as of right now, from what I'm gathering, it seems to be the Charizard is the main selling point of the set. All the other cards that I've seen come by so far have not sold for quite as much. Now, I haven't seen a Blastoise or a Venusaur come by yet, but we do have some of these cards that have been graded, especially by CGC, coming down the pike, so we'll take a look at that in the following auction recap. A few more interesting modern card sales. Here is a Black Label Japanese Umbreon Gold Star card from the 25th anniversary set, sold for $650 this week. And then here, folks, is a PSA 10 Charizard GX from Hidden Fates, hitting a new low this week. At least as low as I've seen it go in quite some time, selling for $490. And I think if this card is going to sell for less than $500, I might have to pick one up. Because, like I said, this card was averaging $1,000 for the longest time. This week, it has been cut in half since then. So, might be a good time to pick this card up as a PSA 10. What do you think? Up next, we have the Mewtwo GX Secret Rare card from Shining Legends. Still remaining a very healthy PSA 10 price, selling this week for $610. Here we have the Pokemon 151 Japanese Master Ball Master Set. So a total of 210 cards. Every card in this set sold for $6,305. So needless to say, an extremely popular set. Do you think that is a justified price? Let me know in the comments below. On to the vintage portion of our video, we have some very old Japanese vending prism cards that came by. from 1996. Here is a PSA 10 Golem, sold for $636. We have a Machamp that sold for $725. This Moltres here sold for $970, and the Zapdos sold for $1,088 this week. We saw one first edition base set card come by. It is a PSA 10 Hitmonchan Holo with a brand new cert on it that sold for $9,200. Here from Jungle Set, we have a first edition Clefable in PSA 10 that sold for $2,325. From Fossil, we saw another Gengar come by that sold for $3,275. And from Team Rocket, we saw a first edition Dark Blastoise that sold for $2,805 this week. On to the Neo series, we saw a Typhlosion 18 Holo, not quite as expensive as the Typhlosion 17. This card is a PSA 10 sold this week for $805, while a PSA 9 Typhlosion 17 sold for $1,524. And it's just one of those cards that you never see come by as a PSA 10, because I do believe it is the lowest pop holo from Neo Genesis. Speaking of Neo Genesis, here's a Japanese Lugia holo in PSA 10, sold for $745. We have one card from the E-Series. It is this holo Gengar from Skyridge, sold for $3,450. And then we saw two cards from Team Rocket Returns. It is a Rocket's Zapdos EX that sold for $578, while the Rocket's Moltres EX sold for $960. A few old school EX cards. Here's a Jirachi EX from Crystal Guardians, sold for $578. We saw the Salamence EX from EX Dragon Frontiers sell for $1,070. The Suicune EX from Team Magma vs. Team Aqua sold for $2,500. And then this Lugia EX from Unseen Forces sold for $2,950. And then we saw several examples of sealed product come by. Here is a first edition Gym Heroes booster box, sold sealed for $11,988. Here is a Gym Challenge box, first edition, that sold for $13,750. We saw a base set unlimited booster box also sell for $13,750. And then here's a first edition Team Rocket booster box, sold for $13,100. And then also from TCA Gaming was this EX Emerald booster box, which are about as scarce as they come, folks, selling this week for $13,107. On to the numerous Shining, Gold Star, and Crystal cards from the PWCC weekly auction block. Let's start off with the Shining cards in this Shining Celebi that sold for $1,500. Here we have a Shining Raichu that sold for $2,010. Shining Tyranitar sold for $3,360. And then we have this Japanese Shining Mew that sold for an even $3K this week. Here's a Shining Mewtwo that sold for $3,600. From Neo Revelation, we saw a Shining Magikarp sell for $2,520, and a Shining Gyarados that sold for $5,040. And then last but not least for the Shinings, we saw the first edition Shining Charizard sell as a PSA 10 for $8,700. And then we saw numerous, if not all, of the Crystal cards come by. Here is a Crystal Kabutops from Skyridge that sold for $1,230. Here's the Crystal Crobat that sold for $1,920, and the Crystal Nidoking that sold for $1,830. We have a Crystal Celebi that sold for $2,220, and the Crystal Ho-Oh that sold for $5,520. Here we're getting some big numbers, folks. We have the Crystal Lugia that sold for $9,000, and then the Crystal Charizard, of course, selling for the most at an even $12,000 this week. And then on to the numerous Gold Star cards that sold. Here is the Gold Star Celebi that sold for $2,280. The Gold Star Alakazam sold for $2,640. Jolteon here sold for $2,880. Groudon sold for $4,440. And then here we have a CGC10 Gem Mint Gold Star Charizard from EX Dragon Frontiers that sold for $7,500. Here we have a Gold Star Trico that sold for $4,440, along with this Gold Star Mudkip that sold for $5,640. We have a Gold Star Pikachu from Holon Phantoms that sold for $8,100. And then we saw a few Gold Star Espeon cards come by. Here's one in PSA 9 that sold for $3,360, while a PSA 10 sold for an even $9,000. And it's also worth noting that a PSA 10 example sold on eBay for $8,500. And then here is my favorite favorite Gold Star card. It's the Gold Star Gyarados that sold for $11,100 this week. And let's not forget the PSA 8 Gold Star Rayquaza that sold for $4,320, while a Japanese Gold Star Rayquaza in PSA 10 sold for $11,700. And then also from EX Deoxys, we saw a Gold Star Latios in PSA 10 sell for $16,200, and then the Gold Star Latias knocked it out of the park, selling this week for $38,400. Wow. A couple of amazing Japanese graded cards that came by. Here is a Espeon Prime Daisuke Club 7200 point promo card in PSA 8 that sold for $6,600. And then we saw the PSA 10 8600 point Master Scroll promo card that sold for $19,800. Which leads me into the sale of this Gold Star Torchic, which in PSA 9 sold this week for $3,480, but we did see a PSA 10 example come by on eBay, and it sold for $37,600. And a little bit of history about this card, if you don't already know, this card had previously sold, about 18 months ago for about $43,200. And it's also worth noting, because I have documented many auctions on this channel, that back in mid-2020, around June, this card had sold for $14,850. So in about 3 years, the card has gained a total of about $23,000 in value. And that concludes the auction recap, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting the channel. I really, really appreciate it. That's all I got for you today, folks. You know the drill. I'll catch you all in my next one.